Whoosh. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show you guys the steps and process that I use to make this coat. One of the things that I really need to mention is the fact that anytime you do a cosplay, you just don't automatically go and like have everything you need to start working on the cosplay. So when you want to make a cosplay, one of the very first things you need to do is do your research or your homework. It's very important that you look up your character. So like in this specific instance, like I chose to do Gray from Fairy Tail. So basically, in order to do this, I need to have reference material. I need to know what this character's costume or normal outfit, whatever you want to call it, what it actually looks like. The very first thing I did is I actually watched Fairy Tail. I actually went while I was watching it, and every time there was an angle, like a specific angle of his character, like for example, like for his hair, or for like the coat, or for his shoes, or for like his little bracelet, or like the necklace, like all the little details, every different possible angle that I could capture, I took a screenshot on my computer each time. I wound up with like at least 100 screenshots, and I know that may sound kind of crazy, but the more reference material you have, the more accurate you can be in your endeavor. I know that not everybody's, goal is to be super accurate. There's nothing wrong with not being super accurate. There's definitely some fun to just that freedom of like being able to change things and alter them to make them a little different, to make them your own. For me, in this particular one, I wanted to try to aim for accuracy as much as I could. So having all those different angles and different shots for his clothes made it a lot easier to know what they actually looked like. I drew out like just a really rough sketch of like all the components that I would need to do this cosplay. So it can be pretty intimidating trying to do one and not really have a general sense of what you need to do. So whenever I like drew out all of these little things, it kind of gave me like, step 1 is the necklace, step 2 is finding these bracelets, step 3 like might be getting a belt. But if you have this going on right here like this will help you break your cosplay down into simpler steps, and you can focus on one piece of the cosplay at a time and not be so overwhelmed. 1, you need a character to cosplay. 2, you need reference photos. 3, you need an action plan. Draw out all the pieces of the cosplay you need. 4, go get supplies and materials that you need. If you need certain tools for the job, get those as well. As you can imagine, step 5 should be actually starting the cosplay. That's where we get into this jacket.
So there's actually several video tutorials out there that show you how to take a t-shirt or some article of clothing and create a pattern from it, and that is actually what you will see me doing here. There's lots of great tutorials out here on YouTube. I'd advise you check them out. And this is actually one of the steps in my research whenever I was going to do this cosplay. But essentially what you do is you take a piece of your clothing, find where the seams are, and trace that piece out. In essence, you recreate or repiece together the whole shirt. So for me, it was actually much easier doing this method than trying to find a pattern that already existed. As you can see here, I actually purchased some tissue paper to use as my pattern pieces. I actually did several hours worth of YouTube, just looking online, researching, trying to figure out how to accomplish this, because this was actually my first attempt at ever sewing any clothing ever. You may notice that I have left extra space around the actual size of the template that I created for each section, and that's because you need that extra space, so whenever you go to sew it together, it will actually allow you to have really nice seams when you finish. So now essentially I took each individual template that I made out of the tissue paper and cut it out. Also, it might not seem that important, but as you can see, I ironed it out several times over, and that helped ensure that the pieces were the correct size that I actually needed them to be. I also took the time to pin the wrapping paper to the fabric, so that way it was much easier to cut out and much easier to manage. There were a few pieces I actually had to cut out twice, so once I had it cut out once, unpin it, pin it to the fabric again, and cut it out again. And if you're wondering how I knew how many pieces I needed, when you look at the template or the shirt that I was using, you basically have the two sides, 2 sleeves, 2 cuffs, like 2 side pieces, and then you have like everything in the back, including the collar, is typically 1 piece, but everything on the sides actually needed 2 pieces, 1 for each side. I should also note that I used a shirt that fit me. I tested it, wore it. It's a shirt I've worn for a while, so I knew it fit me. Therefore, making a template from that shirt means it should fit when I am finished. So, let's say for example you're doing this for somebody else and not for yourself. Be sure that you get a shirt or whatever kind of article of clothing it is that fits them, so that when you're finished with it, it will actually fit them. This method also meant that I didn't really have to worry about measurements all that much. For example, I didn't really have to worry about taking those measurements that a tailor would take to make clothes that fit you appropriately. I should note, because this was actually the first time that I was truly sewing a piece of clothing, I felt that it was pretty important that I ran some scrap fabric through the sewing machine so I could see how it actually flows through the machine, what if the stitch is the right stitch I need to use. I feel like this is a good practice, especially if you're new to this like I am, because if you don't do this, say you cut all that fabric out and you go ahead and just get to sewing it, what may happen, you may ruin your fabric. Granted, you can actually take it out with the seam remover, but to do that, it can actually take a fair amount of time. So this piece you see me working on is actually a mock-up version of a cuff for one side of the jacket. Here you actually see that I am cutting out the actual cuff now that I have a feel for how I should be doing this. So earlier I mentioned how I actually needed 2 pieces, 1 for each side. Basically here all I'm doing is simply putting it on the other fabric, tracing it, cutting it out, and creating that alternate piece. So I have both variants of it. Now this coat specifically has a multi-tone design to it. So what I did, once I had the basic shape of the pattern, I actually broke it down into several pieces so I could achieve that multi-toned color effect. This actually made the whole process of creating this jacket quite a bit more challenging, as it required a bunch more pieces to be sewn together versus if this would just been a single color or tone jacket. Furthermore, instead of just doing this out of a single sheet of fabric, I actually made it to where the inside was fully white and the outside had the multi-tone. So the coat is actually 2 layers of fabric on top of each other. At this point, I am actually adding, I don't know what it's called, unfortunately, but it's the substance that you put in fabric that you actually are supposed to iron onto the fabric that gives it a little more rigidity. And that's exactly what I did here. This is for the collar. This piece specifically I'm sewing right now is the collar. In addition to ironing it, I also sewed it together for extra reinforcement. Here you can see me taking those smaller pieces I broke down earlier and recombining them to make the original pattern piece. This actually took a lot of extra care to make sure that the pieces, when put together, actually came out the size they needed to be. I am sure there is a name for this method, but basically what I am doing is I'm taking the fabric, folding it inside out in essence, so that I sew on the inside of the seam. So whenever you flip it over, the outside piece has a really nice clean seam. I also made good use of the iron constantly throughout this process, just to keep things from being wrinkled and to keep things smooth, so it was easier to manage and work with. So I am not sure how obvious it is, but I actually have two sets of scissors on the table. One set is just a normal pair of sewing scissors, which, by the way, don't use your sewing scissors for anything except fabric or thread. If you use it for other things such as paper, it will dull the blade and it will not be as effective when you use to cut fabric. So don't use it on anything except fabric or like thread. So the other pair of scissors on the table are called pinking shears. Now pinking shears are scissors that have this zigzag pattern, and actually when you use them to cut things actually have a zigzag shape. So unfortunately the pair that I had was actually very, very dull. So it kind of made things a little more difficult. But anyway, after you have sewn your seam together, on the inside typically, you will have these extra bits of fabric. Those extra bits of fabric you actually want to not leave as is, because what happens is they have a tendency to fray. So when you cut the edges with the pinking shears, you actually get a resistance towards fraying. This is actually important because this means that your end result or your end product will actually hold together better and last longer. I actually also took the extra time to sew down the seams a few times for extra reinforcement. So here you can actually see me struggling to use the pinking shears that are super, super dull. So again, just to reiterate, using scissors only on fabric and thread keeps them sharp for cutting fabric and thread. Using them for other things makes them dull. Additionally, you want to make sure that you do not cut too close to your seam, as if you do, you run the risk of your seam coming undone. This is one of those things that I learned after the fact, but you'll see in a moment there's a piece that is actually the back piece of this, and I cut it too short. Did not realize it. I actually had to recut this piece because I actually cut it to the size of the original shirt length and not the jacket length, which actually brings up the next point. I did not copy the shirt's design verbatim. I made some minor modifications to suit the needs for what I was trying to accomplish. So for example, this jacket or coat is actually longer than that shirt would be, so I had to increase the length so that it was the size I wanted it to be. So have you ever worked on a project for so long but you felt like you weren't getting anywhere? I must admit there was a time or two where I kind of felt this way. But right about this time, there was actually this point of seeing the physical representation of this coat realized. This was actually a nice little extra kick of motivation to just keep going. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but anytime you're doing something in the creative process, sometimes you hit this point of what they call flow. But essentially it just means you are so in the zone or tuned into what you're doing that like you just don't notice anything else, and you have a tendency to be super productive. Well, needless to say, I know I hit this point during this process, and it was a great feeling. Around this time, this was when I was actually starting to get to put all of the pieces together. I am sure you noticed this, but I used pins very often to hold pieces that weren't yet sewn together. This just helps make it a little easier to make sure that you actually sew where you want. Now, while you bring that through the sewing machine, you want to make sure to pull those pins out before you actually sew across it. Say you leave the pin in when you're sewing across it, there's a chance that the needle will actually hit the pin. It could break your needle, it could break the pin, just bad stuff could happen. So just don't do it. That was also just the point where I had to replace that back piece because it was too short. Another cool thing about using the iron through this process is you can actually use it to flatten out your seams to make it easier to sew those pieces together. So because I chose to double the thickness of all of my pieces, or in essence sew the front side and the back side of each part of the coat together, I created a thicker coat, but it also meant it required twice as many pieces. However, doing this made it much more durable. This is kind of random, but I should mention that so inside your sewing machine there's this thing called a bobbin that runs the second part of your thread through that makes your seams. So say you're sewing a seam but there's little thread left on your bobbin, you will have to take that seam out if it runs out and re-thread your bobbin, then re-sew that seam. Fortunately, this was not an issue I ran into, but I figured it was something worth mentioning. Conversely though, it is worth noting that there were several times where I had to take a seam out, which is just not fun. So taking an extra moment or two to make sure that what you're sewing is correct and that it's lined up will save you time in the long run. The collar on this jacket was actually a little tricky because the shirt I used, the collar was comprised of a few pieces, so I had to take into account the curvature of how the collar fit around each of these pieces, not to mention just combining the pieces together so they actually looked right. Again, as this was the first time I was actually sewing any type of clothing, I did have to use a little bit of trial and error to figure out what worked. I wound up kind of making a few mistakes, but managing to fix them on the collar. I cut a little too far in, cut a little too deep, but it worked out in the end. So this whole process actually spanned somewhere around 40 to 50 hours. I think it was closer to the 40-hour range. I actually did most of this work in a 4-day weekend. But I should also note that was the only thing I did all weekend. I did nothing else except wake up and work on the jacket. Now granted, I did do things like eat and brush my teeth and like take a shower, but I did like the basic minimal things that you would do in a day. It is definitely safe to assume that each of those days I spent at least 12 hours dedicated to nothing but this project. So let's say that you don't have a 4-day weekend that you can work on your cosplay. What you will have to do is you will have to take it a few hours at a time, or however much time you can dedicate per your day. So say you never have a day off, maybe you come home, you just work on it for an hour. You'll get it finished as long as you keep working on it. If you think, I've got like 4 months, I can wait, that is typically the attitude that will lead you to, it being 5 days before the event you want to present your cosplay at, and well, it's not finished, so then you're scrambling to try to finish it in time. Anyway, talking back on the coat that I'm working on in this video, you could see that a minute ago I took the dark blue fabric and just kind of measured it along the length of the coat. Again, I really didn't use any measurements while I was doing this. I just kind of, I don't want to say guessed, but more like an educated guess where I lined it up. I already knew the length that the coat would be, so I just took that blue fabric, lined it up against that edge, and cut it a little longer than the coat so I had a little bit of extra playroom. I then took that dark blue fabric and used it as a trim to cover the rough edge left over from the seams, but this piece was actually part of the actual coat design, so it really helped in concealing that part. And in addition, that also means it was going to be less prone to fraying. So about around this point, I actually had a sleeveless, collarless vest in essence. Sewing the collar on actually took a pretty fair amount of extra care just to make sure that it lined up right and that it was actually even. And by even, I don't just mean that it was centered, but I also mean that each side of the collar set up the same height from the base of the shirt, that the part that like would sit on your shoulders. So here you might notice that I'm actually not in the shot. The reason why this is because I actually took the coat as it was and tried it on. So there comes a stage where you actually should try it on to make sure that it will actually fit you. There were several instances where I took the coat off screen just to try it on, even when it was barely beginning. Like I took that long strip of like one side of the front just to make sure it was the right length, that it looked right, that it fit right. Even though it wasn't complete, just doing that helped me assess if I was moving in the right direction or not. So right around here came the really fun part. It was the sleeves. At this point, I had had everything basically put on the coat except the sleeves. So this part was definitely a challenge because the sleeves follow a circular round path. So if you were to compare this to the rest of the coat that I had already done, everything else basically followed a straight path and was really easy to sew. The sleeve actually follows a circular path that is closed, unlike the rest of it. So it's almost like a 3D cylinder. So basically, running the sleeve around in a circle on the sewing machine was the way to achieve this, because I had already sewn the actual armholes on the coat part shut. Now, I do not mean that there was no opening for the arms in the armhole. I just mean that it was a closed circle, which basically meant I had to sew around a 3D circular path. So whenever I initially attempted to do this, it didn't work. I had to take the seams out because it just failed. It was just bad. I tried pinning the sleeves, which also did not work. What wound up working for me is I loosely sewed the sleeves together, just hand sewed them. So after I loosely sewed them together, I once again tried it on. I checked to make sure that the shoulders in the jacket actually worked functionally and that it felt and fit correctly. After verifying that it fit nicely, I sewed the sleeves on using the sewing machine while leaving my hand sewn thread intact. I then once again tested the sleeves by putting the jacket on, verifying that it was good, took the jacket back off, and then used the seam ripper to take out the hand sewn seams I had sewn. Another tricky part of this jacket was actually trying to sew the blue trim onto the collar pieces and to keep the collar even. Unfortunately, I was not as successful in this as I wanted to be. So typically on a shirt that has a collar, the collar, especially if it's a button-up shirt, can be popped up, but usually sits down or it's folded. Well, in this instance, this jacket, the collar sits up. So this could potentially be a drawback to using the method where you take a pre-existing article of clothing and modifying it for your purposes. This process was actually pretty enjoyable for me, especially because I'd never done this before. So I had to do a lot of research, use knowledge I had from varying sources to figure out how to assemble this thing. I have been rather pleased with the final product that I had come out with from this project. I've actually taken it to several events and it has held up quite well. I've not had any rips or tears or any problems with any of the seams yet. I personally would take this route of using a pre-existing piece of clothing to create a new piece of clothing, or for like a cosplay. However, I definitely can imagine that this is not always going to work, especially because some characters, their clothes or their costumes are so elaborate or so unique or so like unrealistic almost that you can't really use an existing piece of clothing to make it. But on the other hand, for your more basic clothing like pants or shirts or jackets or jeans, like more standard normal everyday clothing that like a character may wear, I definitely see this as a useful method to use when you don't have a pattern. One thing I know I will try in the future is I will attempt to sew a sleeve into the shirt instead of waiting till after I've already closed the armholes. Speaking of the sleeves, the cuffs also followed a circular path that you had to sew around whenever you attached them in the way that I did here. However, the cuffs do follow a much straighter line than the actual sleeves do. So I really hope that you guys found this video informative or it helped you in some way. This video really just documents my first true experience at trying to make a cosplay. I've had several cosplays in the past, but they were ones that I just like got different pieces and pieced them together. This is the first cosplay that I actually made, so it's a totally different experience when you make one. I know that I did not cover every single thing that I did during this whole process, but if you have any questions about how I did it, if you want more specific details, feel free to ask me. I am actually planning on documenting every cosplay I do in this fashion, so if there's a better way I could approach it, or if you have any suggestions, feel free to send those my way also. So here's the question for you guys. What was the first cosplay you ever made, or what's the first thing you ever sewed? I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say. Do you have any interesting stories, or were there any challenges you faced whenever you tried your first cosplay or the first time you sewed? Or for those of you who have never made a cosplay before, what would the first cosplay you make be? How would you go about it? Well, thank you so much for spending this last 25 minutes or so with me. I really hope that this was of some use to you. Thanks again so much. Until next time.